My son's wife told the women at her tennis club that I smelled like sawdust and regret. She said it on a Tuesday afternoon at the country club cafe, not knowing I was sitting 2 tables behind her with my back turned, finishing a chicken salad and reading the sports page. I'm 67 years old, and for the past 9 years I've let my son believe I was scraping by on my pension and a part-time handyman job out of my garage. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the small carpentry shop I opened in 1989 in a leased warehouse off Route 9 had become Hollister Millwork and Cabinetry, a custom architectural woodworking firm with 3 production facilities across New England, 460 employees, and a contract book worth $78 million a year. When my son's wife laughed about my smell that afternoon, I didn't turn around. I didn't say a word. I paid my check, walked to my truck, and drove home to a house I built with my own hands in 1991. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I had already decided what was going to happen. If you're watching this, drop a comment and tell me where you're from. This story is about what happens when your own family decides you're a problem to be filed away instead of a man to be respected. And it's about the quiet moment a father realizes his son has become someone he doesn't recognize. Most folks see what my son sees when they look at me. A heavy-set guy in his late 60s with a bad knee and a beard he forgets to trim. I drive a 2001 Chevy Silverado that I've had since it was new. The bed has a homemade plywood toolbox bolted into it because the original liner cracked years ago and I never bothered to replace it. I wear flannel shirts from the Tractor Supply in Danbury, Carhartt jackets that have been patched at the elbow with iron-on denim, and steel-toed boots that have been resoled 4 times by the same cobbler in Bethel. I bring a 6-pack of Yuengling to family cookouts, because I don't drink craft beer, and I think wine tastes like vinegar. I eat my sandwiches with the crust on. I keep my haircut at a one-chair barbershop, where the cut still costs $16 cash, and the barber is a Vietnam vet named Bobby, who knows I take my coffee black. My son is 36. He went to Boston College on partial scholarship, and a lot of student loans I quietly paid off when he wasn't looking. Now he runs corporate strategy for a regional bank in Hartford, makes around $220 a year before bonus, drives a black Audi Q7, and lives in a 4-bedroom colonial in Avon that I helped with the down payment on without him knowing. The wire came from a Shell LLC, and the closing attorney told him it was a family trust contribution. He never asked which trust. His wife is 33. Pretty in that careful, expensive way some women learn in their 20s and never let go of. She runs a boutique interior design firm out of West Hartford that does kitchen renovations for orthopedic surgeons and divorce attorneys. She has 6,000 followers on Instagram and refers to her clients as her people. In 9 years of marriage, she has never once asked me what I do for a living. Not once. She assumed she knew. Her assumption was that I was a shop teacher who retired into hobby work, and her husband, my son, never corrected her because he'd come to believe the same thing himself. Her father is the one who should have known better. He runs a mid-sized commercial real estate brokerage out of Stamford, 61 years old, 3 failed marriages, currently on his 4th, and he carries himself like a man who's been told he's important by people he pays. His name doesn't matter for the purpose of this story, but I'll tell you, he has a habit of clapping a man on the back and calling him chief, which is the kind of thing men do when they want you to know they think you're beneath them. Her mother volunteers at a horse rescue and tells everyone at every dinner that she has a degree in art history from Connecticut College, which she got in 1984 and has done absolutely nothing with since. They live in a 6-bedroom in Farmington with a koi pond the husband had installed the same year his second marriage ended, and a 4-car garage that holds 3 cars and a Peloton. The first time I noticed something was wrong was at Thanksgiving last year. My son's wife brought her mother along to my house, even though I hadn't invited her. I cooked a turkey, made my late wife's stuffing recipe, set the table the way Helen used to set it. Her mother walked through my dining room and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Oh, this is so charming. It's like a little time capsule in here, isn't it?" I let it slide. I've been letting things slide for years. Then her mother started asking my son right in front of me about my long-term care planning. She used those exact words. Long-term care planning. As if I were already drooling into a bid. My son nodded along thoughtfully, like he and this woman had been having private conversations about me. They had. I knew they had. After dinner, my son's wife asked if she could just take a quick peek upstairs, which she explained was for design inspiration. I said sure. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee and listened to her walk through the bedrooms with her phone out, taking pictures she didn't ask permission to take. She came back down 20 minutes later and told her mother that the master bathroom was a project, which is interior designer code for rip it out. That night, after they all left, I sat on my back porch with the dog. My wife had been gone for 6 years by then. She passed in the spring of 2019, ovarian cancer, 11 months from diagnosis. We were married for 38 years. She knew everything about the company. She built it with me. The first office we ever had was the kitchen of a rental in Waterbury, and the first contract we ever signed was on a card table she dragged in from the garage. She kept the books for the first 9 years until we could afford to hire someone. Her name is on the original incorporation papers right next to mine. When she died, I never took her name off anything. Not the deed to the house, not the mailbox, not the founding documents. The lawyers offered. I said no. I tell you this because what came next was not just an attack on me. It was an attack on a life 2 people built, and only one of us was still around to defend it. 3 weeks after Thanksgiving, my son came over alone on a Saturday morning. He brought donuts, which is what he used to do in college when he wanted to ask for money. I made coffee. We sat in the living room. He looked uncomfortable in a way I hadn't seen since he was 16, and had to tell me he dented the side of his mother's Buick. He said, "Dad, we need to talk about the house." I said, "Okay." He said, "It's a lot of house for one person." I said, "I built it for one family. I'm 1/4 of that family. I figure that's enough." He didn't laugh. He'd lost his sense of humor sometime in his late 20s and never gotten it back. He said the house was underutilized. He said I was sitting on equity. He said his wife had run some preliminary numbers, and that with current Litchfield County valuations, the property could be worth somewhere between $900,000 and $1 million. He said it like he was doing me a favor by telling me. Then he said, and I'll never forget this exact phrasing, "We've been thinking, what if we transitioned the deed to us now, while you're still healthy, and you took the in-law suite over the garage? Rent-free, obviously, and we'd cover taxes." The in-law suite. Over the garage. In the house I built. Rent-free, obviously. I asked him what his wife thought of this plan. He said, "Honestly, Dad, this was her idea. She's worried about you." I almost laughed. The woman had been in my house exactly 4 times in 9 years, 2 of those for funerals, and she was worried about me. I said I'd think about it. After he left, I went into the spare bedroom I use as an office and pulled out a folder I keep in a fireproof cabinet. The folder has my will, the business succession plan, and a single notarized letter my wife wrote 2 months before she died. I read the letter again. I read it 3 times. Then I put it back in the folder, closed the cabinet, and sat in my desk chair for about an hour without moving. Then I called my attorney. His name is Saul. He's been my corporate counsel for 26 years. He picked up on the second ring like he always does, and when I told him what was happening, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Tell me what you want." I said, "I want everything bulletproof. I want the house in a trust by next Friday, with provisions that make it legally untouchable. And I want you to start a quiet review of every business relationship I have with anyone connected to my daughter-in-law's family." He said, "How quiet?" I said. "I want to know what we have, and I want options." He said, "Give me a week." The week stretched into 10 days. While I waited, the en-masse week conversation kept happening. My son called twice. His wife called once, sweet as syrup, to tell me she'd already found a wonderful assisted living community in Newtown that had a 4-week trial program. She actually used the phrase trial program like I was a streaming service she was thinking about subscribing to. Her mother sent me a card, a real card, in the mail, with a horse on the front of it. The card said she hoped I was considering all my options, and that she was here to talk anytime. She signed it with her first name and 3 little hearts. I burned the card in the fire pit out back the same afternoon it arrived. Then my son and his wife came over together on a Wednesday evening. They didn't call first. They walked in through the side door like they already lived there, and they had a folder with them. The folder was prepared. There were tabs. There were sticky notes. There was a printed-out floor plan of my house with proposed renovations, marked in red pencil. And the master bedroom, my bedroom, the one I'd shared with my wife for 28 years, had been relabeled Guest Suite Sow Future Nursery. My son's wife sat at my kitchen table and walked me through the proposal like I was a client. She said the in-law suite over the garage was 440 square feet, which she described as very livable for one person. She said they'd been generous with the timeline, giving me up to 9 months to transition my belongings. She said her father knew an estate attorney in Hartford who'd already drafted the deed transfer paperwork and was willing to handle the whole thing for a family discount. Her father's attorney, drafting paperwork for my house. I asked her if her father had also drafted paperwork for the house in Farmington. The Koi Pond house. The 6-bedroom one her parents lived in. She blinked. She said, "What does that have to do with anything?" I said, "I'm just asking. Are your parents transitioning their property to you and your siblings? Is your father moving into the apartment over his own garage?" She said her father's situation was completely different. She said her father was a private investor, and his assets were complex. I said, "Mine are simple, are they?" She said, "Robert, please don't make this difficult." That was the first time she'd ever called me by my first name. In 9 years she'd called me Hollister, exactly once, the day she married my son, and otherwise she'd called me nothing at all. She'd talk around me. She'd ask my son to ask me things. She'd pretend I wasn't in the room. I said, "I'll take the paperwork. I'll have someone look at it." My son said, "Dad, who would you have look at it?" I said, "I know a guy." He laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Dad, this is Connecticut estate law. You can't just have your handyman buddy review this." I smiled at him. I said, "You'd be surprised what my handyman buddies know." They left the folder on the table. After the door closed, I sat with it for a long time, and then I called Saul again. I told him what was in the folder. He said, "Robert, who's the drafting attorney?" I told him the name. He went quiet again. Then he said, "Robert, this man has been disbarred in 2 states for elder financial fraud. He's currently practicing in Connecticut on a probationary license. He's not allowed to handle real estate transactions involving anyone over 65 without supervisory co-signature. The fact that they're using him tells me everything I need to know about what they think this is." I asked him what we had. He said, "We have plenty. Let me come over Saturday." Saul came over Saturday morning with a leather portfolio and a cup of gas station coffee. He laid out 3 sheets of paper on my dining room table. The first sheet was a list of every active business relationship Hollister Millwork had with any entity tied to my daughter-in-law's family. Her father's commercial brokerage had referred us to 4 major projects over the last 6 years. An office tower in Stamford, 2 retail conversions in New Haven, and a luxury condo development in Greenwich. Total billed work, $4.1 million. The brokerage took a finder's fee on each one. Standard industry practice. The second sheet was a list of upcoming projects we were already contracted on. 2 of them were tied to her father's brokerage. One was a 48-unit condo build in Westport where her father's firm was the exclusive listing agent and counted on our cabinetry as a marketing differential. The other was a hotel renovation in Mystic where her father had personally introduced us to the developer and was getting a kickback I'd known about for years and never said anything about because that's how the game is played. The third sheet was the interesting one. The third sheet was about my son. My son had been quietly involved, through his bank, in a commercial loan package for a real estate fund his father-in-law had set up 2 years earlier. The fund was called something innocuous. The bank had extended a $16 million line of credit. My son hadn't approved it himself. He wasn't senior enough, but he had signed off as a strategy consultant on the underwriting memo. He had also, according to Saul's source, advocated internally for the deal to be expedited because of family connection benefits to the institution. Family connection benefits to the bank. He had used me. He had used my company, which he didn't know I owned, as collateral language in an internal banking memo. He'd told his colleagues that the Hollister name was a known regional brand with substantial commercial real estate exposure, and that the family had deep ties to the borrower's network. My son had leveraged my company to get his father-in-law a loan, and he didn't even know it was my company. I sat at the table and I think I laughed. Not a happy laugh. The kind of laugh you do when something is so absurd it doesn't fit anywhere else. Saul said. What do you want to do, Robert? I said. I want to make 4 phone calls. The first call was to my chief operating officer. Her name is Diane and she's been with me for 19 years. I told her I needed every contract with my daughter-in-law's father's brokerage terminated for cause, effective immediately, citing the disbarred attorney connection and a conflict of interest under our ethics policy. I told her to expedite the closeout on the Westport project to the next bidder and to issue a formal letter to the Mystic developer informing them we were withdrawing from the hotel renovation due to a non-disclosable internal review. She asked me if I was sure. I said, I've never been more sure of anything. She said, Robert, that's about $3.8 million in active and pipeline revenue. I said, I know. She said, okay, done by Monday. The second call was to my chief financial officer. I told him I wanted a full forensic review of any indirect exposure between my company and any borrower-side entity in the $16 million credit facility my son's bank had extended. I wanted to know if our name had appeared in any underwriting documentation or marketing material. He said he'd have a report by Wednesday. The third call was to a man I've known for 40 years who runs a competing brokerage out of New Haven. He's a good man. We were apprentices together at a millwork shop in Naugatuck back when we were both 19 years old. I told him there was an opportunity coming open in Westport and Mystic, and that I wanted to refer it personally if his firm could absorb the work. He said he'd take it. He said, what changed? I said I had to clean some things out. He said, I figured you would eventually. The fourth call was the hardest. I called the priest at the church my wife and I were married in. Father Donovan is in his 80s now, and half deaf, and he's known my family longer than my son has been alive. I asked him a question. I asked him if you could love your son and still let him fall. If falling was the only thing that would teach him anything. Father Donovan thought about it for a while. Then he said, Robert, the only love that matters is the kind that can survive the truth. If your son's love for you can't survive the truth of who you are, then it wasn't love. It was a story he was telling himself. I sat with that for a long time after I hung up the phone. 2 weeks went by. The contracts were terminated. My daughter-in-law's father started making phone calls he didn't understand the answers to. The Westport developer pulled his exclusive listing from her father's brokerage on a Thursday. The Mystic developer canceled a luncheon. Her father called my son. My son didn't call me, because my son still didn't know it was me. The dinner came on a Saturday in late February. It was supposed to be a birthday dinner for my granddaughter, who was turning 4. My son's wife had rented out the back room of a steakhouse in West Hartford that had wood paneling and a leather banquette and small brass lamps on every table. She'd invited 50-some people, her parents, her sister and her sister's husband, her tennis friends, my son's bank colleagues, a handful of her interior design clients, 2 cousins of hers I'd never met, and me, the father-in-law, the grandfather, in my flannel shirt and my jeans and my work boots, sitting at the end of the table near the kitchen door, because that's where she'd put me. The first hour was fine. I held my granddaughter on my lap for a little while and told her about a chipmunk that lived in my woodpile. She thought that was funny. My son's wife took her back after about 10 minutes and handed her to a babysitter she'd hired for the dinner, because apparently 4-year-olds at their own birthday parties are an inconvenience now. Halfway through the entree, her father stood up. He had a glass of Cabernet in one hand and a steak knife in the other, which he was using to tap the glass like a gavel, and he gave a toast. The toast was about how proud he was of his daughter and his son-in-law for stepping up to take responsibility for the family's legacy properties. He said those exact words, family's legacy properties. He didn't look at me when he said it. He looked at his daughter, who was beaming, and then at the room, who clapped politely, and then he said something about how the next generation always has to carry the load when the previous generation is ready to set it down. My son raised his glass. So did his wife. Her mother dabbed her eye with a napkin like this was a wedding. My daughter-in-law stood up next. She had prepared remarks. On a card. She said she wanted to share some exciting news with the family. She said that after a lot of love-filled conversations, her father-in-law, me, had agreed to transition his property in New Milford so that the next generation could continue the family's roots in Litchfield County. She said the renovation would begin in the spring. She said her firm would be handling the design pro bono as a gift to her father-in-law for his contribution. I had not agreed to anything. I had not signed anything. She was announcing my eviction as a wedding present to herself in front of 50 witnesses while I sat eating a medium-rare ribeye 6 feet away from her. The room clapped. People raised glasses to me. A few of them, strangers mostly, turned and smiled at me in that pitying way people smile at the elderly when they're being praised for being cooperative. I set down my fork. I wiped my mouth with a napkin. I stood up. I said, "Before we go any further with this, I'd like to ask my son a few questions." The room went quiet very fast, the kind of quiet that has texture to it. My son said, "Dad, what are you doing?" I said, "I'm asking you a question. Do you know a company built the cabinetry in this restaurant?" He said, "What?" I said, "The wood paneling, the bar back, the wainscoting. Look at it. It's hand-finished walnut with a mortise and tenon joinery on the bar return. Do you know who built it?" He said, "Dad, I don't." I said, "I built it. My company built it. We delivered it in 2014 when this place was renovated. The owner is a friend of mine. He still sends me a bottle of bourbon at Christmas." My son's wife said, "Robert, please." I said, "Do you know what company supplies the millwork for the new condo development in Westport? The one your father has the exclusive listing on?" I was looking at her now, not at him. She didn't answer. I said, "Your father's brokerage has been using my company for 6 years, $4.1 million in business. Do you know my company's name?" She said, I said, "Hollister Millwork and Cabinetry. 3 plants, 460 employees, $78 million in annual revenue. I founded it in 1989. My wife and I founded it together. Her name is on the incorporation papers. She died 6 years ago, and I never took her name off because she earned her place on that document the same way I earned mine." The room was so quiet you could hear the kitchen door swing. Her father had set down his wineglass. His face had gone the color of old paper. I said, "I terminated every contract between my company and your father's brokerage 2 weeks ago. The Westport project is now being handled by a competitor. The Mystic Hotel is too. Your father has lost approximately $3.8 million in active and pipeline revenue, and he's about to lose his exclusive listing in Westport, which I believe is the largest single asset on his firm's marketing materials." My daughter-in-law said, "You can't." I said, "I can. I did." I turned to my son. I said, 2 years ago, your bank extended a $16 million credit facility to a real estate fund managed by your father-in-law. You weren't the approving officer, but you were a strategy consultant on the underwriting memo, and you advocated internally for the deal. Do you remember that?" He didn't say anything. His face had gone slack in a way I'd never seen on him before. I said, "In your internal memo, you described the borrower's network as having deep ties to the Hollister name, which you characterized as a known regional brand with substantial commercial real estate exposure. You used my name. You used my company's name as leverage to get your father-in-law a loan you didn't think I had any connection to because you believed I was a retired shop teacher with a hobby workbench in his garage." He said very quietly, "Dad, I said. I'm not done. I called the bank's compliance office on Tuesday. Anonymously. They're now reviewing whether your reference to the Hollister name in the underwriting memo constituted an undisclosed related party representation. They'll figure out within a week that it did. That's a regulatory issue, son. That's not something your CEO can wave away. My son sat down. He didn't sit down deliberately. His knees gave out, and he caught himself on the edge of the table. I said, I don't want anything from any of you. I don't want apologies. I don't want explanations. I want you all to understand exactly what was happening here tonight. I looked at her parents. The mother had a hand pressed to her mouth. The father was staring at the tablecloth. I said, you came into my house on a Wednesday evening with a folder, and you told me I'd be moving into the apartment over my own garage. You hired a disbarred attorney to draft the paperwork. You announced my eviction tonight, in front of strangers, as if it were a charitable act. You did all of this because you believed that I was poor and old and tired, and that I would be grateful to be managed. I looked at my granddaughter, who was on the babysitter's lap on the other side of the room, eating a piece of bread and watching all of this without understanding any of it. I said, the house in New Milford is in a trust. It has been since last Friday. The trust has provisions that prohibit any transfer to any direct or indirect family member for a period of 99 years. After I'm gone, the house will be donated to the Connecticut Carpenters Apprenticeship Program. They'll use it as a residence for their first-year apprentices, 2 at a time, who can live there rent-free while they learn the trade. The trust will pay the taxes and the maintenance in perpetuity. My son said, Dad, you can't. I said, I already did. I picked up my coat off the back of my chair. I put 2 $20 bills on the table for my share of the meal, because I don't take charity. I walked over to my granddaughter, and I kissed the top of her head, and I told her that Grandpa loved her, and that I'd see her soon, and that I was sorry the grown-ups were being loud at her party. Then I walked out. Outside, the parking lot was cold. February in Connecticut. There was a thin crust of old snow along the curb. I sat in my truck for a few minutes before I started the engine. I wasn't crying. I'd done my crying weeks earlier. I was just tired, the way you're tired after you finish something that took a long time to finish. My phone started buzzing about 10 minutes into the drive home. I didn't answer. The next morning, I made coffee and let the dog out and read the paper. My son called 4 times before noon. I didn't pick up. His wife called twice. Her mother called once. I let all of them go to voicemail. The voicemails were all variations on the same thing. We didn't mean it like that. You misunderstood. Please call us back. Please don't do this. Please. I didn't call any of them back. Not that day. Not for a month. In the meantime, things happened. The bank put my son on administrative leave, pending review. He kept his job eventually, but he was demoted out of strategy and reassigned to a smaller branch network role at a salary cut of about 30%. Her father's brokerage lost 2 more accounts after word got around, and word does get around in commercial real estate, about why Hollister Millwork had pulled its contracts. He had to lay off 3 brokers and downsize his office. The Koi Pond house went on the market quietly in April. Her interior design firm lost most of its clients within 6 weeks. 2 of them sent me handwritten notes explaining that they'd hired her on her father's recommendation and that they were sorry. I burned those notes too. I didn't need apologies from people I didn't know. At the end of March, my son came to my house alone. He didn't bring donuts. He didn't bring his wife. He didn't call ahead. He drove up in the Audi, parked behind my truck, and walked up to my porch in a wool coat that looked like it had been ordered for an executive he was no longer pretending to be. He knocked. I opened the door. He looked older than 36. His hair had gone gray at the temples in a way I hadn't noticed before. He stood on my porch for a long time without saying anything. Eventually, I said, "You want to come in?" He said, "If you'll let me." I let him in. We sat at the kitchen table where his mother used to roll out pie crusts. I made him coffee. He held the cup with both hands. He said, "I don't know how to start." I said, "Then don't start, just talk." He said, "I don't know who I became, Dad. I don't know when it happened. I look at the things I did. The things I said about you to people who didn't even know you, and I don't recognize the man who said them. I think I started trying to impress her family before we got married, and I never stopped. And somewhere along the way I forgot that I came from somewhere. I came from you, from Mom, from this house, and I treated all of that like it was something to be embarrassed about, because her family treated it like it was something to be embarrassed about. And I thought if I just agreed with them long enough, I belonged to them. I didn't say anything. I let him talk. He said, I don't want anything from you. I'm not here for the company. I'm not here for the house. I just wanted to look at you in your own kitchen and tell you I'm sorry. And I know that's not enough. And I know I don't deserve to come back from this, but I needed you to hear it from me face to face. Not in a voicemail. Not in a text. Here. In this room. I looked at him for a long time. I said, Where's your wife? He said, At her parents'. We're separated. I don't know if it's permanent. I don't know what I want. I don't know what she wants. I just know that I can't keep being the person I was being for her. And she doesn't seem to know how to be anyone other than that person. So we're taking some time? I said, And your daughter? He said, She's with me on weekends. With her on weekdays. We're trying to do it civilly. I said, Bring her here next Saturday. I'll make pancakes. He started to cry. He tried not to, but he did. He put his face in his hands, and his shoulders shook, and he didn't make any sound. I waited. I let him cry. I didn't reach across the table because we were not those kind of men. My son and we never had been. And I knew that reaching across the table would have made it worse. After a while, he wiped his face with his sleeve and he said, Dad, can I ask you something? I said, You can ask me anything. He said, Why didn't you ever tell me about the company? About what you actually did, about any of it? I thought about that question for a long time before I answered. I said, Your mother and I made a decision when you were about 9. We had just moved into the second plant in Bridgeport, and we'd had a good year, and we sat at this table, and we asked each other what we wanted you to grow up believing about us. And we decided we wanted you to grow up believing your father was a man who worked with his hands, because that was true. And we wanted you to grow up believing that you had to earn what you wanted, because that was also true. We thought if we showed you the company, the money, the size of any of it, it would change who you became. And we thought that what we were giving you, the example of 2 people who built something with their own hands and their own time and their own backs, was the more important thing. He said, You were right, in a way, and in a way you were wrong. I said, I know. He said, What was the wrong part? I said, I never told you who I was, even after you were old enough to handle it. I told myself I was protecting you, but I think the truth is I'd gotten used to being underestimated by my own son. I think part of me liked it. I think part of me thought that as long as you didn't know, you'd never have the chance to disappoint me. But you disappointed me anyway. So I should have told you, maybe 10 years ago, maybe 15. I waited too long. And your mother isn't here to tell me I was being a coward about it. And so I was a coward about it for too long. He nodded. He didn't argue. He just nodded. He said, What happens now? I said, Now you bring my granddaughter over on Saturday, and we make pancakes. And on Sunday you go back to whatever life you're rebuilding, and we talk on the phone every week. Not because I'm checking on you, because I want to know my son again, and you have to let me know him, because I've been gone from your life almost as long as you've been gone from mine. He said, Okay, Dad. He stayed for another hour. We didn't talk about the company. We didn't talk about the house. We didn't talk about his wife. We talked about my granddaughter and about the chipmunk in the woodpile, and about a fishing trip we took to the Adirondacks the summer he was 12. He remembered the name of the lake. I'd forgotten it. He reminded me. We laughed about something his mother had said on that trip, and for a moment it was like she was in the room with us. And then the moment passed, and he got up and put on his coat. At the door he stopped. He said, Dad, the apprenticeship program, the one you're leaving the house to. I said, Yes. He said, Could I help with it? Not as your son, as a volunteer. I have a finance background. I could help them set up their books. Pro bono. It would be something I'd like to do. I looked at him. I said, "You'd have to apply through the director, like anyone else." He said, "I know." I said, "I won't put in a word for you." He said, "I know." I said, "If you get in, I'll be proud of you. If you don't, I'll be proud of you for trying." He said, "Thanks, Dad." He walked to his car. He turned and waved at me from the driver's seat. I waved back. He pulled out of the driveway and disappeared down the road, and I stood on my porch in the late March cold, and I watched him go. I never told him that I'd already mentioned his name to the director. Not as my son, as a finance professional with relevant experience who might be interested in volunteering. The director said she'd consider his application on its merits. I said that was all I was asking. Some lessons you have to let your children learn on their own. In some lessons, the ones about being loved, you can quietly tilt the world for them, just a little, and never tell them you did it. That's a father's privilege. That's the part of the job that doesn't end when they grow up. If you're watching this, leave a comment and tell me where you're from. Tell me about your father if he's still around. Call him this week if you can. And if he isn't around anymore, tell me one thing he taught you that you still carry. The world tries to make us think the people who built things with their hands are smaller than the people who built things with their mouths. They're not. They never were. They're the only people in the world whose work outlasts them. My wife built half of a company with me. The walnut paneling in that steakhouse will outlast all of us. My granddaughter, when she's old enough, will know who her grandmother was, because I'm going to tell her every Saturday over pancakes for as long as I'm able. And the apprentices who will live in my house someday will sleep in the bedrooms my children grew up in, and they'll learn a trade in a place that was built with hands that loved it. That's the only kind of inheritance worth leaving. And it's the only kind I ever planned to leave in the first place. I've thought a lot about that night in the steakhouse, and the months that came after, and what I'd say to a younger man sitting where I sat. I'd tell him this. The day my son walked into my kitchen with a folder full of plans for my own house, he wasn't a villain. He was a man who'd stopped being curious about his own father, and curiosity is the first thing that dies when respect dies. Everything that happened to him after that, the demotion at the bank, the separation from his wife, the slow unraveling of the life he'd built on borrowed certainty, all of it was already written the moment he decided he knew who I was without ever asking. That's the law I've come to believe in after 67 years of watching it work. What you assume about people quietly becomes the world you live in. My son assumed I was small, and so he made small choices. His wife assumed I was poor, and so she built a marriage on a foundation of contempt for a man she'd never bothered to know. Her father assumed I was beneath him, and so he leveraged my company without ever once wondering whose hands had actually made the wood that hung on his walls. Each of them paid for their assumption in a different currency. None of them paid because I punished them. They paid because the truth has a weight to it, and when it finally lands, it lands hard. I think the lesson isn't about money, and it isn't about revenge, and it isn't even about who built what. The lesson is that there are three things a man has to keep alive in himself if he wants his life to mean anything at the end of it. He has to keep his honesty alive, even when it would be easier to lie about who he is. I waited too long to tell my son the truth, and I wear that. He has to keep his mind alive, alert to the difference between people who love him and people who manage him. And he has to keep his backbone alive, because the world will spend every year of your life trying to convince you that going along is the same as being kind. It isn't. It never was. Helen used to say that a man's character is what's left of him after the people who didn't love him are finished using him up. She said it the year we opened the second plant, when a man we trusted tried to take half the business out from under us. We let him fail. He failed. She was right then, and she's right now, even though she's been gone 6 years. If you're sitting somewhere watching this, and you've been letting yourself be made small by someone who shares your last name, please hear me. The kindest thing you can do for the people you love is refuse to be erased by them. They won't thank you for it tonight. They might not thank you for it next year. But the love that survives the truth is the only love that was ever real to begin with. The rest was just a story someone was telling about you while you weren't paying attention.